Everybody, welcome back to the show. We are in the middle of what we're calling our own mini series right now around new alternative uses of CO2. Didn't officially come out with the mini series, but in the conversations we've been having,
Absolutely.
it just kind of,
Maybe we'll name it that.
yeah, you know what? Let's
Mini series.
backdate a couple of the
Go
episodes,
backwards.
get traction, get viewership through the roof. But
Repurpose some old ones.
this is not what content creators do.
Absolutely.
But in this mini series that we are now formally coining as alternative use and new and creative uses of CO2, we have the 12 team. Super appreciative of both of you joining. Andy Stevenson, he's the vice president of project development, and Yusuf Tazi is the CO2 development manager. And so they work on the same team, helping to commercialize CO2. And a little bit about 12, and Andy, you coined it best. Carbon transformation company converting CO2 into plastics, chemicals, and fuels. But step one of commercialization is really taking CO2 to create sustainable aviation fuel. That's what 12 is up to. Super interested to see how commercialization has been, understand the size of your market, the future of your market, what products are you going to displace? And so I think we've got a lot to talk about.
What challenges you're facing and all that.
Absolutely.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't think Andy coined that phrase. I think that was the mini series, his carbon transformation series. So,
Trademark.
I don't recall that being trademarked at all. So this is the carbon transformation mini series. Great to have you guys on. Look forward to hearing all about what you guys are doing. We're following along as you've been growing and expanding and doing a lot of things with the aviation fuel. So please dive right in. Tell us all about 12 and yourselves individually and what all is going on over there.
Great, thanks guys. Appreciate the intro and yeah, nice to talk with you guys. I'm Andy Stevenson. I lead project development for 12, which involves securing the CO2 supply as well as the renewable energy for our commercial scale projects. That kind of gives some indication to where we are in our development cycle. So we are moving out of the R&D stage to actually working on building our first large scale commercial projects, which is really exciting and really what I joined 12 to help lead about a year and a half ago. As you mentioned, 12 is carbon transformation. That's kind of our technology. What's unique about it, I would say, compared to some other technologies, is it's a low temperature electrolysis process. There's a lot of other companies, a lot of other processes to convert CO2 and hydrogen, in some cases, into different kinds of hydrocarbons. They're often, thermal processes or thermochemical processes, but we've actually developed an electrolyzer that can convert CO2 into different kind of carbon or hydrocarbon products using electricity as the sole source of the kind of input energy driving the chemical reactions. And so we think our technology can enable sort of the lowest carbon intensity score products because it can be powered fully by renewable energy as kind of more renewable energy comes on the grid. And so that's kind of where we see our niche fitting in as sort of all the different, CO2 to chemicals, CO2 to hydrocarbon technologies. Ours is the only one that can be, fully powered by renewable energy. And so that's kind of our selling point.
So are you producing hydrogen in that electrolysis process as well, or are you not capturing that today and just we're focusing on the CO2?
So right now, our electrolyzer is just converting CO2 into different products, but the electrolyzer, it looks very similar in terms of architecture to a water electrolyzer for producing hydrogen. So it actually allows us to repurpose a lot of the design work, the components that have already been done for water electrolyzers, which is an industry that's obviously a little bit ahead of CO2 electrolysis in terms of commercialization. So instead of just having water in our electrolyzer, we have water and CO2. And then instead of having, just the kind of water electrolysis catalyst, we also have a catalyst that drives sort of different reactions between the CO2 and essentially the hydrogen that's being produced inside the reactor. And so that allows us to produce different kinds of products than hydrogen from our reactor. The first one we're commercializing is carbon monoxide. So what our unit is actually going to be producing is carbon monoxide. But as folks who are familiar with the chemical industry will know, carbon monoxide is kind of a core carbon building block for many different hydrocarbon products. And so if we can achieve that conversion step of CO2 into CO, we can then use that sort of CO building block to, combine with additional hydrogen or combine with other unit operations to make, many different hydrocarbons.
Would you do that expansion in-house or through partnership, or is that going to be total development under the 12 umbrella?
Right now, we're doing the sort of full development ourselves, and so developing projects that include our electrolyzers as well as any additional sort of unit operations that are needed. So we talked a little bit about the sustainable aviation fuel. Those projects will require our CO2 to CO, a separate bank of just water electrolyzers, standard kind of commercial water electrolyzers, and then a downstream gas to liquids process, which is another technology that's available to sort of license or purchase. And so the fuel projects will include each of those unit operations. And right now we are developing projects that include all three and sort of piecing it all together ourselves, mainly just in terms of getting speed to market, because even the water electrolysis and the gas to liquids, it's not like I can show up and find a bunch of green hydrogen available at many different sites right now. So in order to get to market quickly, we feel like we have to do it all ourselves. But over time, as the green hydrogen industry develops, and as kind of project developers, third-party project developers figure out the space a little bit more, we intend to sort of partner, establish those partnerships. And we've already been in discussions with a number of kind of green hydrogen project developers about co-location and sort of partnership on projects.
That's interesting. So maybe let's take a step back real quick just so everybody has a full understanding. Describe sustainable aviation fuel. What is it? What's it competing against? How does it compete? And then what's driving the market in that direction?
Yeah, so sustainable aviation fuel is kind of a generic term that's, I think, typically used to describe a liquid hydrocarbon fuel that's essentially a drop-in replacement for conventional jet fuel. And so there's obviously folks who are having more kind of innovative ways to replace, conventional hydrocarbon fuel in planes. People are making hydrogen planes or electric planes, but I think sustainable aviation fuel is typically like a less carbon intensive, but still kind of similar, chemically hydrocarbon fuel. And so that's really the benefit of sustainable aviation fuel is it can be deployed within existing infrastructure. There are sometimes blending limits depending on the type of fuel, but we don't need different planes. We don't need different pipelines. We don't need different terminals. We can use all of that. And so that's kind of the big benefit. And it's also, I think one of the best ways to deploy liquid hydrocarbon fuels is in aviation. It's sort of a sector that really requires a super high energy density fuel that, unlike sort of road transportation or other sectors, can't be addressed as easily with batteries or hydrogen. Right. And so we've kind of got that, that infrastructure advantage, as well as sort of the drop-in nature of it. It really kind of makes it competitive. And I think, like a lot of other sectors, there's different incentives for airlines to adopt sustainable aviation fuel. Some jurisdictions like Europe are taking more of the stick approach, where they're sort of mandating certain amounts that the airlines uplift. And so it's kind of creating the demand just from that sort of mandate. And then the US kind of taking more of the carrot approach by offering, tax credits and other incentives for the airlines or the producers to adopt it. And so that's kind of how the market is developing. And then we're also seeing a big push from the customer side, big corporate customers, like
ESG goals accomplished. And
Yeah. And so, for example, we have this partnership with Microsoft and Alaska Airlines, and it's kind of covering, some of the business travel that Microsoft employees do on Alaska Airlines. And sort of
Now,
that's sort of how they're fitting into it.
there's airports in Europe, or maybe just air regions, or regions in Europe or countries that demand or dictate a certain percentage of all flights incoming use a certain percentage of SAF, right? Is that an accurate statement?
I don't know if it gets down to the specific airport level. It's more like, more put on the operators. So an airline has to have like a certain percentage of its fuel. I think across the entire EU, there may be some kind of sub mandates for different countries. So yeah, they could probably pick and choose a little bit like which airports,
Right.
They're choosing, but it's kind of an overall region wide mandate.
So just to put it in perspective, because I've always heard that the one of the biggest opportunities, and obviously you get your plastics and some of the other things that long term as well, but is aviation fuel. So to put it in perspective, I think in the U.S. today, commercially non-enhanced or EOR oil recovery, we use about 10 million tons of CO2 a year. If everybody converted to sustainable aviation fuel with the CO2 basis like you have, how many tons per year are you looking at?
That's quite a bit, and maybe even beyond where we we aspire to get to, because I think with sustainable aviation fuel, there are different technologies. There's sort of ours CO2 to fuels. There's other sort of biomass based fuels, and so we definitely see it as being kind of a mix of those different types. And I think we definitely see potential to maybe do projects upwards of 100 million tons of CO2 per year in producing fuel in the US. And so that's maybe like a kind of interim target we might shoot for as kind of like a reasonable economic potential in a relatively
short
time period.
And the real push here is you're not extracting existing fossil fuels that have been in the earth for millions of years. So we're not pulling more out. We're capturing CO2, creating this fuel that burns, and it burns cleaner. But it's more just we're not having to pull more out and enter the environment, right? So
exactly, yeah.
That, Andy, if you would, with that being the traditional method, 12 has their new technology, CO2 to fuels, biomass, all these options. How do they compare on a cost basis?
Yeah, I'd say right now most of our cost is actually not from the CO2. It's from the electricity. It's similar to hydrogen production. Most of our cost comes from electricity. And so certainly we need the cost and ecosystem of CO2 to develop. We need more capture sources. We need a lot of, CO2 capture. But really for us, the way we're going to be competitive relative to those technologies is decline cost of renewable energy. And that's come a long way in the last decade, but it still needs another kind of, I'd say, step change compared to where it is now for us to be a really exciting technology. And, most people are projecting that's going to happen. That's sort of the future outlook is we'll have more and more wind farms, more solar projects coming online, and that'll be the sort of cost curve we really ride down to get to be cost competitive. And that's sort of our story as a technology.
So hydrogen has that same challenge, and obviously the electrolyzers. The electrolysis.
Say, and compared to sort of the biomass fuels, their biggest challenge is the feedstock. And to generate more feedstock, it just requires more land. And a lot of people think the costs of the feedstock are going to be going up over time just because there are limitations on that. And for us, we're using electricity as our main feedstock, and the cost of that is sort of projected to go down. And so, we're sort of moving in opposite directions in terms of the technology roadmap. I think for both of our technologies, but yeah, certainly overall, we feel like they'll both have a place in the future, but ours in the longer term can be more cost competitive.
So, and some of those feedstocks, would that be like an ethanol base? So if you had a green, fully crabbed, low CI score ethanol mix into some of these aviation fuels, is that kind of a competitive product?
Yeah, absolutely. Ethanol is definitely one of the CO2 sources that we're looking into, high concentration CO2 sources like ethanol plants or renewable natural gas, off gas basically. That is pretty concentrated in CO2. We're looking into those biogenic sources that are concentrated, and into also in the long term direct air capture, where there can be actually some good integrations with our technology in terms of heat integration or other types of integration that we're looking into. And the pulp and paper industry, because most of the CO2 from pulp and paper industry is also biogenic. So those are, I would say, the main categories or the main sources of CO2 that we're looking into.
Electricity is your feedstock, but you are sourcing CO2. Does where you get that CO2 and the CI score associated with that source play into your business model at all, or is it not really turning the needle, and you'll take CO2 from wherever you can find an abundance of it? And part to that, what does the CI score do for you all? What is the incentive there? Is it monetary, or is it more on principle, on the fundamentals of your business?
Yeah, I think for now we're mostly focused, like Yusuf said, on biogenic sources of CO2, or in the future from direct air capture. I think the kind of rules around how those different sources generate different CI scores is a little bit, it's kind of in development right now, but that's kind of the signal we're getting from our customers as well, is that they see biogenic sources as being the ones that are really consistent with a sort of net zero carbon future. And so that's sort of what we're focused on, regardless of whether it has an impact on the CI score or not. And for us, yeah, the CI score typically will have sort of a minimum requirement. There's certain sort of within like the aviation regulatory schemes, like CORSIA is kind of the main like international one. The airlines want their sustainable aviation fuel to qualify with. There's some sort of like maximum CI score for your fuel to be considered sustainable. And so we're pretty far beyond that, but we need to kind of just keep that in mind as like the maximum we could do. And then beyond that, it's mostly to generate additional incentives and things like that. I will say that's one of the big benefits of our fuels. It does have, assuming we use renewable energy, among the sort of lowest carbon intensity scores of all of the different types of sustainable aviation fuels.
So you mentioned early on that you're kind of moved on past the R&D stage. You got into that commercialization phase. Where is 12 today? Where have you advanced? What's your footprint? Where how are things going in that regard?
Yeah, so we've got our R&D facility and pilot plant in the Bay Area in California, and that's where most of our employees are located. And then we're working on kind of building up our pipeline of commercial projects. Right now, we are working on a project in Washington State that, depending on exactly when this podcast gets released, may be announced in more detail after that. So that's something to keep an eye out for. We're going to be announcing some more details about that project soon. And then most of the rest of our development is in kind of the central region of the US. The lowest cost, highest capacity factor new renewable energy resource right now is wind power. And so, the central region of the US is some of the best wind resources anywhere. And so that's a big factor behind that. And then it's also where most of the ethanol plants are located. And so it's kind of, the sort of whole central US has this unique potential, I would say, to be a CO2 electrolysis, just mega hub in the future because of those resources.
That's interesting, because obviously you have a lot of CO2 there from ethanol as well in that same region. You have the whole farm belt, and so. Well, yeah, I wonder, is that just from the land capacity of that? That's why there's so much. I mean, I guess it is kind of a wind torn area, and through a wind tunnel there, so you got high winds and a lot of CO2. That makes sense. Yeah. No, that's great. So let's jump back then. Go obviously cost is a major challenge, or price parity compared to existing things. Subsidies, tax incentives. We know 45Q, or I don't know if this falls under 45V or 45Z, but what are you seeing there? Have you applied for some of these tax credits? Have you seen obstacles? I mean, sustainable aviation fuel seems like it's kind of on the border. Sequestration, cut and dry. You're doing it. Tax credits make sense. Enhanced oil recovery, pretty cut and dry. You think we can apply for it? Aviation fuel seems like that's kind of up in that realm for applying for credits, where there's a lot of fuzziness after that as far as when we're using the commercial use. So have you applied for these credits, and how's that going?
We haven't applied formally yet, just because we don't have a kind of commercially operating facility yet, but we are planning to take advantage of the 45Q utilization credit, the $60 per ton credit. And then also for the sustainable aviation fuel products that are using green hydrogen, we would claim the 45V as well. And then depending on how the rules around stacking are finalized, we could also claim the 45Z or the clean fuel credits. So we could end up kind of combining all three of those together in a single project.
I guess this is kind of what you've spoken on, right? We can't rely on subsidy to get us there. It sounds like you guys have done your homework, where that's icing on the cake, right? You're going to commercialize and then apply. But is that core to your business model, or is that something that you can take advantage of for the next 12 years? And as we talk about it, sequestration is not the only answer. We need viable solutions, alternative uses for CO2, right back to the mini series. So curious how you guys view those credits, core to your business model.
Yes, right now they are core to our business model. Like, we wouldn't be able to, build these first few projects and actually, get an airline or a corporate customer to pay enough to cover the costs without those subsidies. And so they're essential for us getting up and running and starting to get down that cost curve. I'd say, you mentioned a sort of 12-year timeline, or 10 to 12-year timeline when they might run out. I think that's a time frame where we could get closer to cost parity without subsidies. We do think it's always appropriate to include some kind of carbon price. I wouldn't necessarily consider that a subsidy. I'd say right now the carbon emissions are being subsidized by not taxing them. But I think that's really our goal, is not necessarily true cost parity with fossil fuels, but cost parity plus a carbon price. So we always think there's going to be some kind of price on carbon, or shadow price on carbon. In some way it's being priced. And we do think we have a pathway to get there. And like I said, it's mostly going to be driven by the decline in renewable energy costs. That's kind of how our pathway works to get to, close to cost parity.
So have you, I'm sure you've kind of mapped it, and there's some speculation as to where costs ultimately go. Is there because just my belief is, I'm all for subsidies if they're a bridge for innovation to enable new technologies to kind of find a home, because otherwise, like you said, nobody would buy it, nobody would invest in it, nobody would do anything. So we got to create a unnatural parity through subsidies to get that that there. It's when they never go away that becomes the problem. So you've mentioned that the electricity cost is really that biggest factor. Do you see a pathway? If it, and maybe part of the question is, if it didn't have to be renewable energy in the process today, would you have reasonable price parity? And we're trying to get renewable down to whatever, just fossil fuel or natural gas or whatever, electricity, or like, really, is that 12-year window going to be enough to kind of bridge that gap?
We think, it's going to be close. I think that's sort of the challenge. If it was obvious, then I guess, many more people would be doing it. And, I think that it really will come down to kind of how the grid develops. And, as you guys probably know, that renewables are really the sort of cheapest marginal cost, or cheapest kind of levelized cost resource right now. It's really just about the availability.
Right.
Whether they be available 24/7. And so, if additional transmission infrastructure gets built out to kind of enable, transmission of projects and sort of more using the grid almost as storage, if energy storage continues to improve, that's really gonna be the key over the next decade. And there's so many people working on that. It's critical for so many industries, electric vehicles and things like that, that's we're sort of just another bet on that transition happening. Certainly there's other more unique things like advanced nuclear technologies and that we're sort of keeping an eye on, but I think wind, solar plus some form of direct or sort of a type of energy storage is sort of what we see as the roadmap. And any sort of established analysts, I think we can get there. It's just a matter of how quickly it happens, things like that.
So Hal, I've got a couple of questions, and I'm going to really go far outside the scope of my technical capabilities here. But so maybe I'll just invent some new product that you didn't think about yet. But
and remember, we're stealing ideas.
Absolutely, it's all patentable. How scalable is the production electrolyzer? Could you have your own self-contained solar panel generator that's producing it? And then secondarily, you are producing hydrogen in this process as well. Could you not ultimately feed hydrogen fuel cells to then drive a lot of that power after the fact? And maybe I have just made that up, but there's this kind of almost a self-functioning, self-contained system by the end of it.
Yeah, there's definitely some potential for structures like that. It really will just depend on how cheap hydrogen gets in terms of that technology. If you're at some sites like that have larger scale hydrogen storage potential, like with the salt caverns or things like that, there's some sort of unique opportunities there. Certainly, I think like as you look further out and see how some of these technologies could develop, the amount of sort of creative options does open up. And really, that's sort of the holy grail would be, co-located with a large wind, solar, and battery project, getting our CO2 from direct air capture. And so not necessarily reliant on a point source of CO2, and then having the whole thing be kind of a self-contained unit. It's definitely kind of on the long-term roadmap. But not a requirement for our first few deployments.
So just to bring Youssef into this conversation a little bit more. I mean, you're pretty new to 12, of course, but you have a long background in the industrial gas side. What kind of drove you to 12, and what are you seeing as a different market, different industry, and more on the utilization of that CO2 side, and not just the capture distribution side of it?
Well, definitely, I think that 12 is a company where there is a real will to change things and to have an added value and have a mitigation of climate change. And one of the best way actually to do that is to reduce emissions. And one of the big ways to reduce emissions is basically stop creating new CO2, and that's why utilization is a good way for us to basically to mitigate that climate change that we are trying to do in the company, etc. So overall, I would say that's what drove me to 12 is a team of passionate people, a real will to change things, and an innovative technology that is really differentiating in the market, and that's trying to create a new cleaner way of transportation overall.
Yeah, that's great. So you got your new hub coming on. What's next? What's the future? What are we going to see from 12 in the next couple of years? You mentioned kind of plastics and other products as well. Where do you go from here?
Yeah, I think definitely the big focus in the next year is going to be getting that first sustainable aviation fuel project up and running, and kind of show that this technology actually works and can produce at a industrially relevant scale. And then we've got a list of kind of other products that we're working on. I think I think, one of the really interesting things is you can actually make different types of hydrocarbons within the electrolyzer itself. One option is to make CO out of our electrolyzer and then, react that with other things to make chemicals. But we can also use different catalysts to make, other sort of hydrocarbons within our electrolyzer. People talk about ethylene sometimes as one that you can make directly. That's a very big market. And so those processes aren't as well developed, but that's kind of the longer term roadmap is really improving our electrolyzer technology to make other types of hydrocarbon products. But that's that's something that we will have the ability to do once we are producing sustainable aviation fuel in commercial quantities. So that's definitely the big focus for right now.
And I guess to wrap, right, and bring back to the core of our podcast, right, the supply side of CO2. What does this mean? It means you guys are going to need more CO2. You're looking for new sources of CO2. And, we're just looking at the landscape and how it's changing and bringing awareness to those that want to hear us talk and ramble, that there are new technologies coming online, that CO2, it's totally changing. I mean, the supply is going to be constrained, but we are going to bring more supply online. Who is using CO2 today may not be, who is using CO2 tomorrow as a 12 steps in as these new products are developed. And so, at the core of this message, it is keeping the thumb on the pulse of what the CO2 landscape looks like. And I appreciate you both coming on and giving us kind of the deep dive into who 12 is. And, congratulations on the commercialization. Excited to see this project that hopefully will be announced by the time we launch the podcast up and running. But really insightful and just good information for everybody at home to be keeping in the backs of their minds and be keeping up with.
Yeah, absolutely. What didn't we ask? Anything else? What else do you want to talk about? Anything good that we've missed? I think you guys have your hands full. I think you're doing plenty.
No, I don't think so. I guess one of the things, we're
just redefining how planes fly. I mean, that's fine. Nothing more than that.
Definitely a lot to it. Yeah, I will say, I totally agree with what you guys are saying, that there will need to be, an order of magnitude or multiple orders of magnitude change in the amount of CO2 that's just being moved around the US and other countries as well. And so that's kind of one thing we're starting to dig into a little bit more, is obviously as people propose the pipelines, which is a cost-effective way to move CO2, but also rail, truck, barge. We're kind of curious to see how all of those other modes of transport are going to develop and which ones will be sort of economical. And so it's fun to kind of pull out the map and figure out, hey, how could this all fit together at a really large scale?
Yeah. That's there's always this fear, with a lot of our end users and customers as well. And then that's kind of the message that we like to, project out there is the fear is, well, CO2 is going to go away. We need to find, new sources of other things or alternatives to CO2. I think there's an overabundance of CO2. We just need to find cost-effective ways to utilize it and new uses for it. And aviation fuel is way up high on the list of something that will use a tremendous amount of volume. It's just going to, as you noted, shift the entire supply chain of CO2. I mean, you might have CO2 exporters by the time this is done, like I said, whether it's barge or rail or whatever it is, because there's places and countries in the world that don't produce as much CO2 that will need. I mean, if you're making sustainable aviation fuel out of CO2, but you have all these green initiatives that stop emissions altogether, well, then you're going to need CO2 to put it in here. So, and it's transferring around carbon tax credits and all sorts of, new things. It's just an entire new market, an entire new industry. And, the ones that can't figure that out and just keep doing it the same way are going to get kind of run over. And it's the ones that innovate and think forward, the ones that are going to win. So we're excited to continually watch how this progresses and obviously take part of it ourselves, and excited for what you guys are doing there.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you both for coming on. Appreciate you guys. We'll be in touch. We'll keep our eyes posted.
Guys.
Absolutely.
We'll look for the invite to Washington.
Yeah. my plane is booked, and I'm like looking at the Google flights for my CO2 emission impact when I book that flight. So
there you go. Did you donate to the
Always, every time. It's not a question, man. It's a question of ethics.
You're way too cheap.
I'm Mr. Ethics.
You're way too cheap. All right, guys.
Cool.
Have a great
Thanks,
one. We
y'all.
really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.